We also have coming to speak to us today as our second historical witness, the Reverend Dr. Peter Wherry. Dr. Wherry is the pastor of the Mayfield Memorial Missionary Baptist Church here in Charlotte, and he's recently joined the board of a group here in Charlotte appointed by the City Council that's meant to help reevaluate the way that policing takes place here in Charlotte. Dr. Wherry, I'd love to hear from you as you testify today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadler. I'm honored to be a part of this discussion, and I want to just lift up a few things. The problem with this particular subject is crossing out enough things to be able to fit within the time we have. However, I'll say that this service opportunity spanned several weeks into a few months, focusing on reimagining police and policing in Charlotte. And I served on the larger group, but also in a subgroup 4. And I can tell you, just as a spoiler alert, out of this engagement did come some very promising things, even as we look at many others that still need to take place. So the reason, so I had a chance to sit a week ago, the 12th, in a private setting of the City Council, where some of our ideas were thought through, and I concurred with some of the things some of the council people mentioned about making incentives for policing more attractive, that Charlotte be an employer of choice. But I agreed with that for different reasons than I think were perhaps in that room. I agreed because I know there is an inverse correlation between the level and sense of appreciation felt by officers and their propensity to engage in excessive violence in the performance of their duties. And so it is, I asked very pointedly of the council that this process, as positive as I think it has eventually been, not be tainted by a false equivalence, which elevates incentives for police to the same level of urgency as the pain of Black people and others of color, which has occasioned the angst and aggression in our streets. I will tell you that my own psychic pain almost dissuaded me from participating and accepting this opportunity, because I began to think through the fact that what occasioned the sea change that's happening in so many parts of the country, I believe, was the close proximity of the deaths of Harold Easter here in Charlotte, January 26th of this year, Ahmaud Arbery, February 23rd, 2020, Breonna Taylor, March 13th, 2020, and George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. All this in Charlotte in the shadow still of the killing of Keith Lamont Scott on September 20th, 2013. It drove me, and now it's clear that it also drove the rest of the country into a very dire place. And so as a practical theologian, I've learned over the years to listen in moments of stress. And I heard the blood of these citizens and others crying out to me from the ground that there may be no more fruitful time than now in our city, and hopefully in our country, to creatively and aggressively pursue substantive and operational change in the way Black life is treated. And in response to what former Deputy Chief Foster said, one cannot force anybody to value Black life, but one can certainly better manage the feral, malign, and ignorant impulses of violence against Black life by some people in power in our country, here in our city, including the broader culture of policing in America. So I wanted to lift up just a few things that our subgroup made prominently as forceful recommendations to the Safe Communities group on council. That first of all, we ought to require all future CMPD recruits to live within the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. And officers living immersed in the unique culture of a city, Charlotte has a unique culture, will have fewer opportunities to succumb to what I call suburban bias, which at times may be class-based as well as cultural, that is, racial. Uh, these same officers, I think our group concluded, will also approach their duties every day with a more concrete stake in the community they serve. And so, with that backdrop, I think as many incentives as are feasible ought to be extended. At least that was our conclusion. Secondly, another thing we concluded is that there ought to be financial disincentives for officers to mistreat Black and brown people. For too long, there have been no meaningful sanctions personally levied against officers who mistreat and murder people. And of course, officers who are bad actors, we thought ought to be held more personally accountable than they have ever been or ever will be under the current regime of law. Fact is, our discussion concluded that officers who are bad actors may display more careful regard for life, even Black life, if they are certain to face some financial liability, since no legal liability is likely in the near future. This fear, so-called, of Black bodies from armed police officers notwithstanding. We concluded as well that the time has come for the entire posture and purpose of CMPD, our Charlotte police, at protests to evolve. And I'll just summarize this by suggesting that they ought never show up. And Dr. Sadler and I and others witnessed the transformation in temperature on a street when a flatbed truck of SWAT-clad police rolled up to a peaceful protest. They ought never show up in SWAT gear, and they ought to have bicycle lines never obstructing movement. But also they ought to be First Amendment protectors. They ought to be protecting the right of protesters to exercise that protected right of dissent. Our discussions also revealed that where there is interagency cooperation required to change something, that city council in our town ought to at least come out and full-throatedly endorse some things that they cannot immediately enact. And that may require the state legislature or the district attorney to implement, and that there ought to be a concrete plan for moving those ideas forward when that takes place. We finally, and there's so much more I could say, but perhaps in the Q&A, some of that can come out, Dr. Sadler. But we finally took a look at a peaceful protest and peaceful demonstrations. We took a look at the legal process, particularly we took a look at the misdemeanor and the felony level, but at the felony level. And we also took a look at the Civil Service Board and its potential cooperation with the Citizens Review Board. And so rather than take up too much time with a lot of detail that may come out in later discussion, I think I will end my comments there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wherry, both for your participation on this panel and for your testimony here tonight. I would like to ask you, as you go on, you've mentioned a number of changes in policy and changes in the direction of the police force. Do you believe that these changes will begin to shift the way that Black and brown people are treated here in Charlotte? Do you believe that they will have a racial impact?
I'm cautiously optimistic about that. I really am optimistic more than cautious. Because one of the things that's going to happen in our CMPD, and of course, this is not telling tales out of school, but is a reformation, a reimagining as well in Charlotte of, instead of having the Cahoots program, for example, come in, we already have CPCRT group in CMPD, which has officers that are trained in de-escalation and mental health. But this will also involve now, for the first time, mental health professionals and counselors and social workers taking calls that involve people with perhaps presenting mental health issues, rather than marked police vehicles ever showing up to that call. I think that's one thing that's going to come out of this. One of the other things that's going to come out of this, I believe, is a reevaluation of youth programs in our city so that they are outcome based, and we support and give more resources to programs that we see and can track are really helping improve police relations and community policing and youth programs across the city. There will be policy changes. There have already been some. For example, that tear gas has been done away with, and I challenged personally the council to get rid of pepper spray, and so eventually other things will go by the wayside. Because factually, on the receiving end of pepper spray, there's a distinction without a difference between that and tear gas. There will be budget adjustments at the same time to make sure that resources are funneled to programs that bring people and police together and that ameliorate conditions of suffering in the city. In summary, I think that's just a teaser of some of the things that are going to come out on October 26th in the council meeting. It's going to be a pretty comprehensive statement. I think I do commend our city for having walked and chewed gum at the same time. We haven't just fired some people and moved dollars around with broad strokes, blunt terminology like defund police, but we really have taken a thoughtful look at the comprehensive, holistic reimagining of policing in our city. And I believe good things are going to come out of it.
Well, thank you so much for that report. Thank you so much for what you're doing there. I believe that this is a good beginning. We, as Robert Frost said, have miles to go before we sleep, but at least we started this significant journey.